So before I introduce Taylor Carman, I think since this is the last session, it would be a good opportunity to thank Therese, thank Denis, Christopher, everyone else who's put all of this together. And over to Taylor Carman of Barnard College, Columbia University, whose title is not on the handout, so I have to leave the
Well, on the program, it is Phenomenology and the Primacy of World, which I wrote before I wrote the paper. So it still stands, I'll stick with it. But what the title doesn't tell you is that the talk is structured around a presentation of the views of Heidegger and then Sartre and then Merleau-Ponty about others, our being with others. It's a kind of, it's not exactly a polemic, a sort of critique represented by all three of them against the so-called problem of other minds. So I have to announce that I'm not, even though our conference is called Minds in Dialogue, I'm not going to be talking about dialogue exactly, and I'm not really going to be talking about minds. I'm going to be talking about people being in the world together, sharing a world, which is sort of the basis of a problem called the problem of other minds. I'm not going to try and solve the problem of other minds because Heidegger and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty don't think it is or can be a problem. And that's the sort of argument. But what I'm really thinking about in presenting this material is something more methodological, like what is phenomenology? All of them are doing phenomenology. And I think there's a very interesting question that only comes up, well, hardly ever in Sartre and Merleau-Ponty explicitly, Heidegger a bit more so, about how it is that phenomenology could be addressing a topic like this without just collapsing into a sort of report of appearances that might not tell you how things really are. So I'm going to begin with talking about that. Okay, so the reason that I'm not going to be talking about minds, apart from the fact that Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty don't really use a concept quite like that. Husserl does, more so, since he's talking explicitly about consciousness. Sartre and Merleau-Ponty talk about consciousness, but I think they're very suspicious of the concept, our concept of mind. I also think that our concept of mind is a bit of a dubious hodgepodge, a grab bag of disparate phenomena, none of which has either the clarity or the primacy of our concept of a person. So it is, after all, as Peter Strawson observed, persons who have minds, and we identify minds and mental phenomena generally, if we can do so at all, systematically, by knowing a priori where to look for them, namely where there are persons whose minds or mental states we suppose them to be. So I'll be avoiding the concept of mind for another reason, though, more specific to my topic and to the three philosophers whose accounts of our relations to one another I will be presenting here, namely those of Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty. The specific reason is that unlike Husserl, Edmund Husserl, their common predecessor in the phenomenological tradition, none of those three, call them the existential phenomenologists, has anything quite like, say, the Cartesian conception of mind, certainly, especially in its definitional contrast with the concept of body. There is for them, therefore, no such thing as an epistemological problem of other minds, since our most basic experience of others and of ourselves is, again, an experience not of minds, but of persons. Saying this much is not to say that there are no other kinds of problems or questions about others, there are plenty of them, but only that there can be no problem of justifying a belief we supposedly have in the existence of their minds, which, at least according to some, we cannot perceive, on the basis of our perception of their bodies, which we can. So to say that our experience of others is an experience not of minds but of persons is to say that the existence of others must already be somehow manifest in a kind of a priori way in order for any question about the mind to be so much as intelligible. I shall proceed by considering the three existential phenomenological accounts of our fundamental relations to others in historical order, beginning with the most resolutely anti-mentalistic of them all, which is Heidegger's. So, Heidegger. And by the way, the handout is a bunch of passages from Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. I'm not going to read out all of these. There's two or three of them which I will refer us to and probably read them out. as we go. But I just figured I would give you a surplus of text to look at and consider so that we can think about not only how Merleau-Ponty understands our relation to others, our fundamental relation to others, but also what he's doing in doing phenomenology in addressing this question or topic. Okay, so back to Heidegger, though. In Being and Time, Heidegger simply asserts, without argument, that's usual for him, that our being in the world just is a being with others, Mitsein. It's not that I exist and then contingently encounter others. Rather, my most basic experience of myself, which is to say myself as a self or person, is already an experience of being among others. Simply declaring that to be the case, as Heidegger does, might seem crude and dogmatic. It is what Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, calls Heidegger's, quote, brusque and slightly barbaric way of cutting through the Gordian knots rather than trying to untie them. So be that as it may, I think Heidegger is not wrong. Moreover, to see why he's right is not just to see that the existence of others is somehow self-evident. It's also, at least as much, to see why this brusque and slightly barbaric cutting of the Gordian knot is methodologically legitimate. That is, that it is a reasonable move to make in the course of philosophical inquiry. It's moreover phenomenologically correct as a description of our basic experience and understanding of one another. But this requires that I say a few words about phenomenology and how it differs from scientific inquiry and theory. So, and this is Heidegger, section 7 of Being and Time, in the introductory sections in Being and Time. To put it simply, as Heidegger does in section 7, phenomenology cannot, P.C. Husserl, be defined as a science of mere appearances or of subjectivity. And this is because, like appearing, seeming, and looking, concepts like appearing, seeming, and looking, all presuppose the more fundamental concept of a phenomenon, what Heidegger calls a phenomenon, by which he means something simply manifesting or showing itself as such, sich zeigen. So, for example, a storm can be said to appear to be gathering on the horizon owing to the clouds visible on the horizon, just as a disease appears owing to the manifestation of its symptoms. So appearances conceived in this way presuppose the phenomena that indicate them, which are not themselves appearances, at least not in that same sense. And Heidegger observes that Kant equivocates on this point by sometimes referring to objects in space and time themselves as appearances, which is to say phenomena. Heidegger would say those are phenomena, they're showing up, while at other times, as he does in the Prolegomena, to defend his concept of things in themselves, which do not show themselves, Kant defends this notion, at least at one point, by insisting that, after all, for there to be appearances, again, in the sense of phenomena, there must be something doing the appearing. That is, something the phenomena signal or indicate, as the clouds indicate the storm or the symptoms indicate the disease. Similarly, so that's one contrast between phenomena and appearance. It's a particular concept of something appearing in virtue of something else that's manifesting itself that indicates the thing appearing. There's another distinction that Heidegger draws, that is something seeming or looking a certain way, or indeed seeming to be other than it is, which is what Heidegger calls semblance or Schein. And this also presupposes the concept of a phenomenon as that which shows itself as it is. So here Heidegger anticipates an argument advanced later by Wittgenstein and Sellers, namely that seeming talk is logically, Wittgenstein might say grammatically, parasitic on being talk. So for example, in the collection of remarks called Zettel, Wittgenstein observes that it would be pointless to teach children color words by first teaching them to say, in every case, to say, this looks red, this looks green, and so on. If these are the utterances in which the child learns how to apply the color words, then the qualifier looks is doing no work and can simply be dropped in favor of this is what is called red, and this is what is called green, and so on. Once a child has mastered the color words themselves, she can then, but only then, qualify the attribution with words like looks, seems, or appears. And as Sellers says, seems then expresses something like doubt or hesitation that the thing really is the color it looks to be. he's got an example of somebody in a store looking at a tie. The tie looks red. Is it really red? And so on. You have to have an understanding of what it is for something to be red, even to make sense of the worry that, well, it looks red, but maybe it isn't. So absent some prior understanding of what it is for something to be read, no sense can be made of the idea of its looking or appearing to be read, as Heidegger says. And I don't know, I think this remark, or whatever it is, must precede Heidegger, but so viel Schein, so viel Sein, right? Okay. So it's a simple argument, but it has momentous implications for the very idea of phenomenology as a way of doing philosophy. For what it implies is that phenomenological descriptions of how things show up for us cannot be dismissed as merely subjective reports of how things seem, which, one might suppose, tell us nothing about how they really are. More precisely put, if you want to contrast phenomena in the primitive sense of things just showing up with something more objectively real, you have to specify what the objective reality is, or might be. It cannot simply be taken for granted as whatever remains after you strip away all of the subjective appearances. I mean, I think my suggestion there is just that that would just be an empty concept. Now, my own view, and I think it is Heidegger's view, is that there is, in fact, a plausible counter-concept to the concept of phenomena as he understands them. But it's not anything like the Kantian noumenon. It's instead physical reality, as successfully anyway, described by the natural sciences. That is, I think Heidegger's a kind of realist about the world as described by the natural sciences, and that's fine. He even has, in some lectures in I think 1928, he even talks about entities sort of entering into what he calls world. So world is clearly, in his sense of world, which is kind of like life world or world inhabitable by persons, there are things outside of it and they can sort of enter into it, like comets, things like that, or things we discover. But it's not that they don't exist if they're not in the world. Okay, so ordinary experience is, of course, susceptible to illusion and error, but that doesn't entail that phenomenological description necessarily falls short of a kind of objective correctness. Let's see, I'm going to skip a little bit. I've got some examples that I maybe don't need to belabor. So it's a mistake to say that the scientific representation of the world is objective and therefore just gets it right, whereas ordinary experience, which is the source of our phenomenological observations, ordinary experience and understanding, again, as elaborated in phenomenological description, is merely subjective, hence moot and philosophically inconsequential. Wilfrid Sellars was right to say, I think, that we cannot force what he called the manifest image and the scientific image together piecemeal, bit, by supposing, for example, that the world is, or might be as we ordinarily experience it, but minus, say, secondary qualities, or minus intentions and agency, and finally just minus persons altogether. You're not going to end up with a coherent picture. And that's why I think he thinks that the early modern philosophers were just on the wrong track by saying, well, there aren't colors and tastes and flavors and so on, and sounds and so on, but as if that could sort of square things. There really are these two images, what he calls the manifest image and the scientific image. They are two different but equally indispensable ways of seeing and understanding the world that cannot be just fused into a single image, but can nevertheless somehow complement each other in their differentness. Now, this is as much a question for you. I'm not sure I understand Sellars on this point exactly, so I'll just say what I think he says, and I'm not sure it's going to be quite what I want for my purposes, but it's in the ballpark, and I'm kind of appealing to it as a kind of potential ally. Sellars refers to the combination of the scientific image and the manifest image as something like stereoscopic vision. That's what he calls it. Now, that might seem to imply, I'm not sure that's the best metaphor for what he has in mind, because it might seem to imply an actual wholesale integration of the two images into one, because that's, after all, what it's like to see with two eyes. It looks like you've got one field of vision. rather than a complementarity of some kind. So I don't know if a better analogy might be something more like the integration of vision and touch, which remain different even though they're combined to form a kind of collaborative whole, or music and dance, or two things that remain different in their combination. I don't know. And maybe somebody can tell me if they understand Sellers on this point. In any case, Sellers did apparently appreciate phenomenology, that is the philosophical tradition, as continuing traditional philosophy's articulation, elaboration, and explanatory sophistication of the manifest image. He associates it with perennial philosophy. And I'm also told that he tried, though evidently without success, to get Merleau-Ponty hired at Yale, and that would have been around 1960, I guess. I don't know if anybody here knows anything about that, but who told me that? Tracy Young. Tracy, is that his name? Tracy Young told me that, I think, who was there at Yale. Anyway, surprise to me. Merleau-Ponty died soon after that, and so it never happened, and Sellers left Yale, so it never happened. But he was enthusiastic enough about Merleau-Ponty to try to make that happen, which was nice. Now, Merleau-Ponty did not himself devote much time or attention to questions of method like this, but he might well have been sympathetic to Sellers' binocular conception of the two images. Far more than any of the other major phenomenologists, he tries to integrate the empirical sciences into his own work. And in Phenomenology of Perception, he even remarks on the cooperation of phenomenology with modern literature and the arts. Phenomenology, he says, more generally merges with the effort of modern thought. So there's some kind of collaboration he's got in mind in which phenomenology has a role to play, but its own role, rather than just supplementing science. So the point of Heidegger's brusque assertion that our being just is a priori, as it were, being with, is to deny that others are originally present to us as objects of knowledge or belief, not to mention objects with the peculiar feature of having their own internal subjective contents, which are essentially external and only indirectly accessible to our own subjective experience. I mean, I do think Heidegger was polemicizing against a Cartesian conception of the self or the subject. It's not that nothing like that could possibly be true, only that that is not how I first experience being in the presence of other people. Let me just clarify that that last sentence was as much me, if not more me, than Heidegger. So Heidegger is just stating our being in the world is being with, period. And Descartes was wrong. So I'm trying to finesse that a little bit with this methodological idea, which I think is consistent with other things Heidegger says, which is to say, it's from this phenomenological point of view that we are entitled to say anything like fundamental radical skepticism about the existence of others and their minds has no place in our experience. So indeed, it's only thanks to, and is going back to Heidegger, it's only thanks to the inescapable background of being with them, of being with others, that questions about, say, their inner or private contents of their minds or consciousness could ever even be intelligible, as I said before. We already have to have a concept of person, but also a familiarity with being with persons, which shows itself as it is in itself. So in historical context, Heidegger's brusque assertion that being in the world is essentially being with can be read as a reminder that traditional metaphysics and epistemology, and especially the way of ideas that arose in the 17th century, foregrounded mind and knowledge in a way that systematically conflated ordinary experience with scientific or perhaps proto-scientific theories of mind and cognition. So what, after all, is a Lockean idea but the posit of, and this is, I'm repeating here, Sellers' argument about the myth of the given, a Lockean idea is the posit of an incoherent, arguably incoherent hybrid of phenomenology and a kind of proto-neuroscience, or at least a scientific psychology. Heidegger's account of being with is as much a rejection of that conflation as it is a positive description of our experience of others. So again, to say, look, our being in the world just as being with is a pretty blunt assertion. It's not a very thick description of things. So I think in order to understand its importance or its significance, you have to see it as an implicit critique of this tradition, which had blended together two things. One is, how are things showing up for us? And the idea of ideas is supposed to capture that. And is also offering a kind of hypothetical scientific theory about how the mind works. And from the point of view of the phenomenologists, I think that was a massive mistake that sort of systematically made, including in Kant, I'm afraid, the project they were undertaking incoherent. So lest the very idea of an a priori non-cognitive community of Daseins sound somehow dubious or strange or mysterious, I want to stress that Heidegger stresses its relative banality by focusing not on our face-to-face encounters with one another, which might sort of motivate worries and anxiety about what I know about other people, but Heidegger emphasizes our experience of the world itself as an open public space, present and available not just to me and not just to particular others I might have identified, but to anyone. And anyone is my translation of das Man in Being in Time. Heidegger's account of the anyone, or das Man, is more famous as an account of social norms, customs, conventions, conformism, and the perpetual danger of lapsing into inauthenticity by just doing what one does and so on. That's a familiar, famous part of chapter 4 of Being in Time, first division. But in fact, he introduces the term, first of all, as a description of ourselves and others, not as self-sufficient subjects, but as a kind of generic anyone. That is to say, it's the answer to the question, who is the Dasein of everyday existence? And his answer is the who of Dasein, who you are, is anyone, which is to say that's how you experience yourself. You experience yourself as anybody along with all the others. So what that means is that other persons are no more immediately present to me than the world itself as just being there for any of us or for anybody. Others and the world are two sides of a coin. In fact, as Heidegger says, the phrase others is misleading, since at the most basic level, I draw no sharp distinction between myself and my experience and the so-called others and theirs, which is to say, I'm one of the others. So this is another bending of language a bit. I mean, he says, by others, he doesn't really mean others other than me. He means anybody, right? And that's supposed to capture the phenomenon that I experience myself as one among the anybody, right? Let me just clarify. This is not to say that that I don't fundamentally understand myself as an individuated person, because Heidegger says I do. And he uses the word Je-Meinigkeit. Dasein is always Je-Meinig. So it's not that I literally don't know which one is me, or I think I'm the whole group, or anything like that. It's that, who I am is not especially distinctive. I'm just anybody among the anybody, right? So, and again, that's to say that the existence of the others is as self-evident as my own existence. So my own existence doesn't have, for me, any more obviousness than the existence of anybody. But it doesn't mean that I'm not aware of my individuatedness as a single person. Okay, so my experience, one might say, is precisely an experience that we are together in a world that is manifestly there for anyone. Okay, now, that's Heidegger. Sartre, as we have seen, was not entirely happy with this account of being with and being in time, and perhaps understandably so. However persuasive the account might be, and actually I think it's very persuasive, what remains odd about Heidegger's account of others is precisely their peculiar lack of otherness. Again, when Heidegger first mentions others, what he means is not everyone else, but anyone, which includes me. Sartre, truer to his own admission that the Cartesian paradigm, sorry, that's a typo. Truer by his own admission to the Cartesian paradigm. I mean, Sartre says somewhere in a later interview, he says, never underestimate the influence on Descartes on French philosophers, including me. He said, Sartre tries to supplant Heidegger's account of this collective being with and this primitive being with, in favor of a phenomenology of our second person, face-to-face encounters with one another. That's what Sartre's account is based on. But that's not to say that he retreated from phenomenology back into epistemology, or into what he regarded, I think, as the bad faith philosophical exercise of skeptical doubt, because he thinks, no less than Heidegger, he thinks the presence of others is self-evident and inescapable, since any doubt we can entertain about others or their existence necessarily comes too late on the scene to dislodge our recognition that they are indeed always already there for us to wonder and worry about. So Sartre offers us, so in other words, Sartre is just as committed as Heidegger is to the idea that the existence of others is indubitable and inescapable, but he's got a different way of trying to defend that claim. And he offers us in Being and Nothingness two different images or scenarios that purport to capture the primal presence of the other in my world. Yeah, and notice when I say in my world, that's something Heidegger would never say, because the world isn't my world, it's the world. Sartre is more comfortable with the idea that the world as I experience it fundamentally is my world. So world for Heidegger is essentially public, hence never the correlate or complement of an individual subject or consciousness. So the first of these two vignettes in Being and Nothingness features my looking at a man in a park walking towards some chairs on a lawn. It is, Sartre says, as if the distance between the man and the lawn is collapsing or is distorted or foreshortened by his seeing it and by his awareness of it. I mean, this is very metaphorical. Notice this is nothing like a scientific hypothesis, right? It really is qualitative and highly metaphorical literary language to evoke something. What does this mean to say that it's as if the distance between the man and the lawn he's walking towards is kind of collapsing somehow? It's not the illusory appearance of an objective change of position. It may be more like the anomalous lines in the Müller-Lyer illusion, which seem to warp away from their objective sameness of length toward a qualitative but not objectively measurable sort of differentness. The intentionality of the other's consciousness is pulling the world toward it, Sartre seems to be saying. It is, he says, he memorably says, as if the other is a kind of drain that my world is now spiraling into, away from me and out of my own immediate grasp. So it's like the other is sucking up the world from me. The other steals my world or threatens to and is thus essentially a kind of enemy, he even says. So there's already a kind of antagonism, a sort of competition for awareness of the world or directedness to the world. Now, even in a second, more famous scenario, which I think is supposed to get even further to the bottom of this phenomenon, according to Sartre, in this famous scenario, I'm unselfconsciously peering through a keyhole into a room, and probably for all kinds of unpleasant reasons, jealousy and whatever, spying on somebody. But then I hear footsteps on the stairs behind me. Now the other is not the object of my subjectivity, but is an even more threatening subject that reduces or threatens to reduce me to a mere object, though of course it can never really accomplish that and so on. And what Sartre says is this is supposed to be a kind of further elucidation of what's going on in the scene in the park. In the park, the other's view of the world, consciousness, he says, is like pulling the world toward it. And what's happening there? I think Sartre thinks even there, what's being revealed is my vulnerability, right? And my vulnerability is really made manifest when I am actually the object of the other's gaze, which is why the gaze or the look is the really primal phenomenon for Sartre. So I think Sartre is proposing something that's ingenious, even if it's not very, ultimately convincing. There's something right about it. He wants to say, again, in relation to the epistemological issues, the reality of the other is revealed not to me through a belief I have in the existence of the other, but rather through my shame at being visible to the other. So it's this affective attitude of vulnerability or exposure, which he thinks is more fundamental than a belief I can form about the other. And any belief I form will already be against the background of being exposed to the other's view. And that's why it's kind of pre-epistemic and therefore can't be dislodged by skeptical worries and doubts. Let me just add, too, that I read Being and Nothingness for years before I stumbled upon this sentence, which I don't know that people discuss very much, but it surprised me until I thought about it. It looks like the existence of others is fundamentally basic, and you would think Sartre was agreeing with Heidegger that our existence just is always already an existence of being with others. But he actually doesn't say that. There's even a sentence in Being and Nothingness where he says, the being for others. And by the way, Heidegger never says that. He never says for others. This is a Sartrean phrase. Sartre says that our being for others is not a fundamental or original or primordial structure of the for itself. So I think, then I thought about that, and I realized, well, I see why he says that, because he's thinking about the individual consciousness just as consciousness of the world, the en soi, the in itself. And I think he thinks that's not unintelligible. I think what he's just saying is there's nothing incoherent about that. So it's a contingent fact for Sartre that we do share the world with others. But given that we do, we can't doubt it. I think that's his view. So he is distinguishing himself from Heidegger. When he says Heidegger is just cutting the Gordian knot, I think Sartre wants to reserve a level of description that Heidegger does not acknowledge, which is that sort of counterfactually, suppose there were no others, would I still be a consciousness with a world that I'm directed to? Sartre says yes. I think Heidegger doesn't even want to contemplate that because he's only considering what's factually or factically the case. Let's see, not to go down a rabbit hole here, but just one more comment on Sartre's view. I don't think Sartre thinks that if that were the case, and it's a kind of thought experiment, I guess you have to entertain, I don't think Sartre thinks you could think of yourself as a person. I think he thinks it's thanks to the gaze of the other that you come to regard yourself as any kind of object of awareness. So that's still pretty radical, but it's a different view from Heidegger's. Okay, now those are the two views to start with. There's the Heidegger and the Sartre. The chapter in Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, entitled Others and the Human World, combines in, I think, a very original way, what you might call the primitive communism of Heidegger's Mitsein with the radical anarchism of Sartre's account of being for the other. And again, that's a construction Heidegger never uses. So the one is the I-we collectivism, and the other is the I-thou sort of face-to-face drama. And after all, Sartre wrote novels and plays, and so he's very interested in human drama. But it's amazing how little of that there is in Being and Time. It's almost completely absent. The I-thou, I-you, second-person thing is almost completely absent from Being and Time. Okay, so now Merleau-Ponty actually recognizes both of these. And, I mean, he wrote his book after the two of them had written their books, so maybe he was in an advantaged position. For Merleau-Ponty, our experience of others has both of these two aspects, highlighted by Heidegger and Sartre, but he observes that they occupy different places in our developmental psychological histories as we grow from naive childhood into mature adulthood. Moreover, neither of those two aspects turns out to be quite what Heidegger or Sartre thought they were. The I-we collectivism of Dasein's being with has a perceptual dimension that Heidegger, again, ignores almost entirely. And similarly, Sartre's I-thou schema is of mutually repellent gazes trying in vain to neutralize each other by means of objectification, though it is undeniably a part of the drama of human life, manages to be so only thanks to our more primitive, naive immersion in each other's experience, which Sartre seems to have considered metaphysically impossible somehow. So consider the first, the perceptual basis of our being with. Obviously, it's not just that we inhabit a world always already structured by the generic anonymous normativity of the anyone, that's Heidegger, it's not just that. In our primitive encounters with other individuals, beginning almost immediately after birth, we are, as Merleau-Ponty likes to say, geared into each other's gazes and facial expressions and bodily movements and gestures and voices, and thereby each other's comfort and discomfort, frustration, contentment, mood, eventually thoughts and feelings and so on that can be articulated and conveyed, whether verbally or by other means. In other words, right from the beginning, we are in the kind of I-thou face-to-face encounter with others. Again, something Heidegger doesn't even really describe. And I guess I'll point you to a few Yeah, let's look at a few passages. If you skip to 8 on the second page, this is what I was kind of channeling or paraphrasing. These are quotations from Phenomenology of Perception. Merleau-Ponty says, I perceive the other as behavior. For example, I perceive the other's grief or anger in his conduct, in his face, in his hands, without any borrowing from an inner experience of suffering or anger. And because grief and anger are variations of, now he helps himself to the Heideggerian phrase there, being in the world, undivided between body and consciousness. See, that distinction is a later kind of, I'll call it a philosopher's or theoretical distinction between body and consciousness, which is not part of our naive experience. Settling on the other's conduct it settles on the other's conduct and is visible in his phenomenal body as they settle on my own conduct as it's present to me. So that's a kind of quasi-behavioristic level of the evidentness of persons to me, especially in childhood. Maybe I'll just stop and point out a few other things. By the way, how am I doing by way of time?
You have about 10 minutes more.
Really? Whoa, okay. I was afraid this was going to be too short, so much for that. So should I stop and read these? Passages 1, 2, and 5 describe the kinds of phenomena that people recently had sought to illuminate or explain by way of referring to mirror neurons. That's a very well-trodden sort of field. I'm not going to say anything about mirror neurons because I don't know enough about them to comment on them. But I will just say Merleau-Ponty and others, going back to Adam Smith, have remarked on various kinds of phenomena that look like they're conducive to that, some kind of explanation. Maybe just quickly. So look at number 1 there. Merleau-Ponty says a 15-month-old baby. Now I'm sure these are studies he's reporting. But I don't know which ones. A 15-month-old baby opens his mouth when I playfully take one of his fingers in my mouth and pretend to bite it. And yet he has hardly even seen his face in a mirror, and his teeth do not resemble mine. His own mouth and teeth, as he senses them from within, are immediately for him the instruments for biting, and my jaw, as he sees it from the outside, is for him immediately capable of the same intentions. Biting immediately has an intersubjective significance for him. He perceives his intentions in his body and my body with his own, and thereby my intentions in his body. Now, that's a little convoluted, not as clear as I would like. Let me read the second one too. There is between my consciousness and my body as I live it, and between this phenomenal body and that of the other, as I see it from the outside, an internal relation that makes the other appear as the completion of the system, and so on. I might as well, okay, that's enough. What he's describing is the kind of immediate, like he often says, intertwining of the bodily experience that hasn't already been understood, separated between mind and body, or consciousness and body, and also has this kind of permeability between one person and another. He says elsewhere that, well, no, I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to leave my, okay, let me get back to my text. Yes, so Merleau-Ponty says he often says we're geared into the world, and we're geared into each other's experience. This is the phenomenology, he says. We're geared into each other's faces, facial expressions, bodily movements, gestures, and voices, and so on. As a developmental fact, that is, our intuitive intertwinement with each other's bodily behavior and experience precedes our cognitive capacity to make conceptually articulated judgment about each other's thoughts and feelings. The absence of anything like a Cartesian concept of mind in early childhood experience is complemented by the fact that I do not perceive the other's body as a mere thing, as an object of cognition or belief. Instead, I experience both of our bodies as animated in the same way, that is, as exhibiting feelings, as projecting actions, and as sharing one and the same behavioral and affective space. So in describing the situation in that way, okay, I'm going to skip, that's a little bit more methodological reflection on, let me just quickly say I'll skip over this paragraph, but what I'm saying in the paragraph is that, look, we can talk about judgment, belief, cognition, either in a more kind of ordinary common sense way, which is the way Merleau-Ponty usually does, which is to say, usually to talk about somebody making a judgment presupposes that they've got an experience on the basis of which they're making the judgment. Now, once you enter into a kind of scientific sort of psychology, maybe you can just get rid of that idea that judgments presuppose a world given to that's about which you're making a judgment. And so I just want to say, I think this is where we have to start separating something like the scientific image, which involves hypotheses or what's the word Sellers uses, we're positing unobservables and things like that, from something closer to ordinary language. Okay. Okay, so, yeah. So do other animals have beliefs? Well, I think it's pretty commonsensical to say yes in ordinary language. But it's, as a scientific matter, as I understand it, there's zero consensus about what to say about this, you know. So, and what about young children? Perhaps pre-verbal infants can also be said to have beliefs, and I think it's even possible for 2-year-olds with language to express opinions. I said in the previous paragraph, I don't think other animals can be said to have opinions, but that's just an intuition, right? And intuition, opinions seem to be the sorts of things you reflect on and can articulate and so on. I think 2-year-olds who speak, I'm willing to say they have opinions. They can answer questions. You ask them about what's the case. There is, however, at a slightly later age, a further developmental leap that occurs apparently at about age 4. Now we're in the domain of developmental psychology, which Merleau-Ponty is happy to introduce into the discussion. You may know, just from your own experience, that when toddlers, say 3-year-olds, play hide and seek, they sometimes hide by walking to the corner of the room and putting their hands over their eyes. Now, an uncharitable interpretation of this error is that toddlers are either egomaniacs or outright solipsists who think that their experience is the only experience there is, and they're abolishing all the others by putting their hands over their eyes. I think a more generous and humane, but also more plausible hypothesis is that rather than regarding themselves as a kind of God with a kind of godlike grandiosity, children under the age of 4 simply lack an appreciation of the differences between one person's point of view and another's. One suggestion in the psychological literature is that toddlers have not yet distinguished the asymmetry of vision from the reciprocity of touch. So pulling my hand away from yours breaks the tactile connection between us. But closing my eyes does not mean that you're no longer seeing me. But I think 3-year-olds haven't differentiated those two systems. And so they're more, their intuition is as soon as I break the eye contact, that's it. Right? I think that's a more plausible way to think about. They're lacking a kind of sophistication in recognizing that vision doesn't work the same way touch does, for example. So according to some studies also, it's not until about the age of 4 that children are able to ascribe false beliefs, either to others or to themselves. I understand, let me just say as a caveat, I'm sure all of this psychological literature is controversial, and so I'm appealing to it slightly casually, but I did this experiment on my kids, and it checked out. This is the false belief test. Should I explain the false belief test? Okay, very quickly, the scenario is you show a 3-year-old what looks like a box of candy. You ask what's in the box, they say candy. You open it up, it turns out to be pencils in the box. And the kid memorably said, holy moly, pencils. Surprise. Then you ask, when I showed you the box, what did you think was in the box? They will say pencils. And you say, now Sally's gonna come into the room, and when we show her the box, we'll close it up, and what is she gonna think is in the box? The 3-year-olds will say pencils. I mean, they don't describe false beliefs. In other words, what people believe is just what's true. Now, so here I have to read you what is basically my favorite sentence in the Phenomenology of Perception. Where is it? Oh, it's on 6, I think. Yes. Right. In other words, it's only in adulthood and with the kind of mature sophistication that we acquire this ability to distinguish our perspective from another's, wonder about how other people might be seeing the world or what they're thinking that's different from what I'm thinking. And Merleau-Ponty says, indeed, this is passage 6, the perception of others and the intersubjective world are only problematic for adults. The child lives in a world that he believes is immediately accessible to everyone around him. He's not aware of himself or indeed of others as private subjectivities. He does not suspect that all of us, including himself, are limited to a certain point of view on the world. For him, and this is my favorite sentence, people are empty heads turned toward a single self-evident world, where everything happens, even dreams, which he believes are in his room. I mean, now here he's going off the rails, of course, right? Others are, for him, so many gazes in inspecting things, they have an almost material existence, to the point that the child, Merleau-Ponty is getting all of this from Piaget, I think, to the point that a child wonders how the gazes do not break when they meet. Now, on the next passage, and these are all right in the same area in the text, in 7, he says, at about the age of 12, according to Piaget, so let me also just be clear, the false belief test literature is fairly recent, so notice that Merleau-Ponty is observing things that seem like congruent with these observations about very young children. At about the age of 12, Piaget says, Merleau-Ponty says, the child accomplishes the cogito and obtains the truths of rationalism. The child would simultaneously discover himself as a sensible consciousness and an intellectual consciousness, and so on. I'm going to skip again a little bit. Piaget brings the child to the age of reason at age 12, as if the adult's thoughts were self-sufficient and would remove all contradictions. And now, another one of my favorite sentences, but in fact, Merleau-Ponty says, children must in some sense be right, contrary to adults, or contrary to Piaget. And that's going back to the we're empty heads open onto the world. So here what I want to say, and I know I'm maybe pushing up against my time limit here, that I think what Merleau-Ponty has in mind is that even in adulthood, there is this persisting sort of sedimented basis of being with that we are in some ways just as naive as the children are. I mean, if I ask you on a clear sunny day, what color does the sky look to other people, you will immediately say blue. Not because you're thinking about what's going on in the heads of other people, but because the sky is blue, and of course that's how people see it. I think we're like children in that way in a lot of our background understanding of each other. So this is a phenomenon, I think it's a lot like what's called transparency. So maybe I'll just end with this and then try and wrap it up. G.E. Moore and Gareth Evans, in various ways, I think Moore says diaphanous, there's this kind of transparency that our own beliefs and experiences have, that is that I think Evans's example is, if you ask me, do I think there will be a third world war, I don't introspect into what's going on in my mind. I ask myself, is there going to be a third world war? It goes right out to the world. And so too, our experience is sort of that through which we're experiencing the world. I think Merleau-Ponty has a kind of idea of shared transparency, that what I think other people are experiencing has, at the fundamental level, before I start, entertaining doubts and thinking about it a lot, what's going on in other people's experiences, just what there is in the world to experience. So again, it almost goes back to the Heideggerian idea that it's the way the world is that determines what anybody and everybody, how they experience it fundamentally. And the idea is that as we mature, we don't just completely abandon the child's view, this naive view, which it may be easy to look down upon, that just supposes that how I see the world is how everybody sees it. So the sophisticated level at which we can really be suspicious of each other and not know what somebody else is thinking or how they're feeling, and we're right to be able to do that. It gives us a powerful insight into the differences among perspectives. But Merleau-Ponty's argument is that and that's more like the Sartrean sort of paradigm, kind of antagonism and competition among subjectivities that can never really be reconciled. But that's only intelligible against this background that's something more like naive being with. Okay, maybe I'll wrap it up by saying, again, what I'm really kind of thinking about at the same time that I'm thinking about these three accounts, and how I do think Merleau-Ponty's account combines the virtues of both of the two of them, but what it also does is invite a kind of complementarity with empirical psychological evidence about experience different in childhood and adulthood that gives us some insight that can be combined with the phenomenology, but not because we can just surrender the phenomenology to a self-sufficient scientific psychology, but because the phenomenology and the everyday experience can be one leg, as it were, with real speculation and theorizing in psychology being the other leg, to give us a kind of binocular vision of ourselves and the world. And I'll stop with that.